Yes, so thank you, Allison, very much. As Allison said, I'm autistic myself. Both my boys are autistic and ADHD, as is my husband, and education has been a significant pressure point for us as a family. So aside from just the general information that's in here, I will be sharing our own personal experience and what we've done along the way, and hopefully that can help prepare families or give them somewhere to start if they're also on this journey of education in Highland. Um, as you can see here, I've titled it "Where and How to Access Learning" because I think when it comes down to it, that's really what we're talking about here is how do we get learning for our young people when the standard practice doesn't necessarily work for us. So, just to start with, everybody I'm sure is aware that there is a presumption of mainstream in Scotland, which says that an education authority has to carry out their duty of providing school education in a school other than a special school whenever possible. And so what does that mean? It means that Scottish legislation actually mandates that learning authorities provide education to pupils in mainstream environments unless one or more of a specific criteria are met to demonstrate that a special school is needed. And the idea here, based in the legislation, language in the legislation, is that separate is not equal. And so the outcomes are better for all pupils and when we're not discriminating against one group of young people for being different in some way. That's the idea, which is admirable. It's an admirable position to take, but not necessarily in practice is it that easy. I think we could all agree. So just that quote there is just saying that the idea here is that we're trying to encourage diversity, we're trying to encourage understanding, and we're trying to prevent discrimination. And again, I think that's very valid and valuable. The exceptions to when mainstream education are to be provided are if it would not be suited to the ability and aptitude of the child. So the child's capability isn't there to allow them to be in mainstream. It would be incompatible with the provision of education to the other students, or it would result in unreasonable cost to the authority. And in this way, you can see that they're saying as long as it doesn't cost too much, or or it doesn't impact other students, or um, uh, so on. And so, what does this mean in practice? What it means in practice is that Scottish legislation assumes that all children will go to a mainstream school unless one or more of the exceptions apply. Um, and there is an assessment process in place. Again, by Scottish legislation, there has to be a process for determining when a specialist provision should be granted. But the starting point for that is always the assumption that you will be in mainstream education. And that can be with link support services on site, so specialist areas within, or other supported targeted intervention. Um, and it has to follow a staged intervention approach. So that staged approach needs to be documented. Um, One thing I want to point out is that Section 15, as this applies to legislation, it is a continuing duty. So what that means is it's not we assess it once and then it's over. It continues to apply. It has to be continued to be referred to. But it is expected that anything other than mainstream school will be a very rare occurrence. Um, and it also allows, as you can see there, because of the exceptions, it also allows the authority to still place a child in mainstream education, even if those exceptions do apply. But they wouldn't be allowed to do that without consulting with the child and the child's parents. So the Additional Support for Learning Act is what guarantees us that we should be having additional support in school for our young people if they need that in order to access mainstream education. And what is an additional support need? So an additional support need is when a child or young person has, for whatever reason, a likelihood of needing extra support um, in order to be accessing their education in mainstream education. Because remember, the presumption is that they will be in mainstream education. So the additional support need is the thing, whatever it could be. It can be temporary, it can be permanent, or it can be long-term, it can be short-term. It's something that means they need extra support in order to be able to access their education. And when we are moving into education spaces where we're going to be learning, there are a number of different ways that we can be doing that. So in mainstream settings, there are the standard education that we're all aware of, but there are also specialist provisions. There are options like flexi schooling and home education, and then there are hybrid approaches. So let's talk a little bit more about mainstream settings in particular. So when we're talking about the ASN needs, the additional support needs, and what that looks like. Well, in order for a young person who has additional support needs to access education in a mainstream setting, it's very likely that they would need reasonable adjustments. And what are reasonable adjustments? There are changes that are made, such as to school policies, classroom support, or physical changes to the school environment that allow that pupil to engage with their learning. And the determination here again on whether or not something is reasonable is if it's effective, if it's practical, and what the cost is to it. So you can request an adjustment which you feel is a reasonable adjustment, and the council can come back to you and say, the cost for that is prohibitive, so we're going to have to come up with another workaround. And that's where we, as parents, as the advocates of our young people, need to be working with the council, with the teacher, the head teacher, with whoever, in order to try to find kind of that common ground where we can say, okay, well, this would still be effective, and maybe the cost isn't as much, because they can say, well, we just can't do that because it would cost us too much to do it. This often comes up when they say that they would need to hire a whole other staff member in order to support your young person if they were to try to put that adjustment into place. And so is understanding that they are legally allowed to say that cost wise that is not the most effective way for them to provide that support to the young person. But there don't have to be costly ways to provide reasonable adjustments. There are lots of different ways that we can provide a reasonable adjustment. For example, we can have just a teacher approach, which is what this graphic from NeuroWild is showing us here, is a teacher who's saying, okay, everybody, are you in your best place to learn? Are you in the um, right environment for you? Are you in the right energy state for you in order to be able to learn? And teacher approach is probably the most impactful immediately on a young person who needs a little bit of extra support in the classroom. Just that understanding and that ability to be flexible with a variety of needs of the various children in the classroom. There's also the practical, so providing practical strategies like backward chaining or scaffolding. Like, you've probably heard a lot of these words, but there are practical strategies that can be put into place for dyslexic students. For example, a very practical and very easy and effective and non-cost heavy adjustment is to make sure that there are colored overlays that they can put on to their work, right? It's very practical, doesn't cost anything really, and it's easy to implement. There's environmental, so creating that right environment, making sure that there isn't an overly bright light coming through the window at a weird angle or something. Just put the blind down, right? Just changing that environment can make a huge difference. And also the personal, let's enable that young person to self-manage and to self-regulate. And I would also say to self-advocate, to be able to say that light is coming through that window in a weird way, and I really need that to stop, right? So to be able to advocate. Putting all of these together is how we create a space that can work for our pupils with additional support needs in ways that don't actually have to cost the earth to do it. And remember that we're always looking for equity versus equality. We don't need everybody to have the same thing. We need everybody to have what they need in order to be able to do their best. So what are some other tools and support approaches that are available within mainstream for that ASN support? You can have assistive technology. The council has an assistive technology support service. So if you're needing to use technology in some way for augmentative or alternative communication, for example, um, there are child's plans, which I'm sure many people are aware of, but we can talk more about in detail. As I mentioned, there's the colored overlays, there's access to occupational therapy and speech and language therapy and educational psychology and primary mental health. There are very specific literacy interventions that can be done. We can have individualized education plans. I've just realized I've got occupational therapy on there twice. Sorry. Um, Personalized support document, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. If they're at exam level, you can have SQA arrangements, that the SQA is actually fairly flexible about accommodations that can support students to do their best on exams. It's about making sure that you've evidenced what that support need is in advance. And so that's a longer process, but that can be done. There are children's community workers through the Child Health and Disability Team, um, dyslexia assessment, nurture groups, all of these things. But mostly, and I want to make sure to emphasize this today, there is the neurodevelopmental profile wheel tool that we have here in Highland that was designed through the Pines training team. And that is an exceptionally practically useful tool that can be used in so many different ways. So where and how are these accessed? So I've split it up there into kind of what you can expect, but the idea is there are things that a class teacher can do. There are things that an ASN teacher and a guidance teacher can do if you're in secondary school. We have stuff on our website. So on the Thriving Families website, we have the personalized support document I'm going to talk a little bit more about, and we have the neurodevelopmental profile wheel. Um, the guidance teacher can in secondary school can be the person who's doing that SQA arrangement stuff for you. We have when we're talking about child's plans and bigger things like that, we can have the lead professional or the ASN teacher or the guidance teacher, whoever the named person is on your child's plan. They can be getting you the access to the child health and disability team, to primary mental health work, to educational psychology, all of those things. And then there are some things that are reserved specifically for the area education manager. And that would include things like part-time or altered timetables. Those things need to be done in agreement with the more senior management in education. Those aren't as locally based, but these other ones you can just access through the people who are your go-to people at your child's school right now. So this is the personalized support document I was talking about. On our website, we call it the Passport to Success, I think. And the idea here is that it's very explicit. So this makes it really easy for that accommodation to be accepted and understood. So we're trying to meet all of those things that I was talking about before. We're looking at the teacher experience of that, the environment, the practical, and how do we implement this in a way that allows that young person to self-advocate. So we've got the areas requiring support, and then the specific support strategies that go directly with that area of support. So I need to wear my hood up when I'm upset or anxious, and the support strategy is for the teacher to allow you to allow that student to wear their hood up. So you can see that it's very direct, very explicit, and that way there's no questions about it. And a young person can provide this in advance. This is something, if you were in secondary school, for example, the guidance teacher should have and should be sending this to all of the class teachers so that they're aware of this young person's support needs, but they can also carry it on them. And that's part of that self-advocacy. They can then say, these are my support needs. There are not many young people in secondary school who will do that because that would call them out as being different. I'm sure we all know that about our young people, that heaven forbid they wear a coat or something because that might make them look different. But they could do it, and we can provide that. And we can also help them by making sure that the right people have it without them having to do that. So this is an excellent support tool because it's so clear and so direct. And we want to also be using language in this that isn't judgmental or accusatory. So the language in this is, again, very direct. This is what I need. This is why I need something, and this is how I help. This is how you help me, right? It isn't about saying, "Well, I don't like this, or I'm not good with that." It's about saying, "This is my need, and this is how you support me." Okay, so those are all things that you can do in supports within mainstream. But if we have one of those exceptions, then we're going to move on to specialist provision. And so what is a special? It's a structured educational setting that's designed specifically to facilitate access to education for children and young people with complex additional support needs that present barriers to accessing standard mainstream education. So basically, it's a place that we can go that allows us to still access learning when one of those exceptions that we talked about, one or more of those exceptions applies. And so the important thing here is that, like with a mainstream school, you can put in a placing request to a specialist provision. So if you think that your child would be best at, for example, the butterfly room for P1 after they've been in nursery at some other school, then you can put in a placing request for them to go to the butterfly room. You can put in a placing request to Drummond School. The way that is reviewed, so like as I said before, there is a process in place to review these kinds of requests that comes through the JAG group, which I'll talk a little bit more in a minute. They're the ones who review those requests. But there are a number of specialist provisions or supported provision spaces within mainstream education within Highland Council. These are just some of them. There are a lot more. And wherever you're from around the Highlands, you probably know what your specialist provision is. But if you don't, then just get in touch and we can help you work that out. The idea here is that you can see you can probably know that there's a range of what specialist provision means. So Drummond School, for example, is a very specific environment that is for young people who really have complex and I don't know how to just, I don't know what word I'm going for, but complex needs that will not be supported appropriately in a mainstream setting. There are other places like the IRA, the West Wing, or even just the core, because there's two different areas at the IRA. Oh, here, sorry. Coffee delivery from my husband. Thank you. Sorry about that. I will explain the Highland Tutoring Service. I will, yes, Jody. So the IRA has both the core, which is just kind of, it's not a contained environment, is what I'll say. There's supported provision there, but it's not contained. And then they have the West Wing, which is contained. So you need a key fob to get into that. And so there are varying levels of what specialist provision means, and it will be different for every one of these locations. And so if you're looking at specialist provision, it's good to have an idea of what exactly is unique or special about that specific place before deciding, yeah, that's where I need to do a placing request to. That's what my young person needs, because it isn't the same everywhere. So how do we access this? Well, spaces in specialist settings and bases within mainstream schools are secured via application to the Joint Admission Group. So that's JAG. And JAG is headed by the senior lead manager for the additional support for learning team in Highland, and that's Bill Couston. And it meets on a quarterly basis, or at least that is the objective. Submissions are made via the child's lead professional. So where I talked before about the child's plan, the submission to the JAG would normally be following a child's plan meeting as one of the actions that comes out of it, or a core group meeting where if everybody was just getting together to talk about that in advance of something. It doesn't necessarily have to result in the child's plan being updated. But the way that normally a professional submits to JAG is by submitting an updated and current child's plan saying this is what the needs are of the young person. And that core group meeting or that child's plan meeting should involve input from the parents and carers, the school itself, educational psychologists, and other relevant professionals to that young person's situation. Relevant professionals who Other relevant professionals who might be included could be speech and language therapy, primary mental health, social work, any of those other services that are involved. And a parental placing request made to a special setting, as I said, is reviewed by JAG. So there are two ways in. Your school can say this young person is going to need a specialist setting going forward. So if, for example, your young person is in nursery and the nursery staff have identified that they have more complex needs than can generally be met in a P1 classroom, they would say, I think we should apply to JAG for your young person to go to the butterfly room. And they would submit that with the child's plan or whatever other relevant information you have. You do not need to have an official diagnosis of anything to get a specialist placement because it's based on need, not on whatever pathological definition you have received. So, but then if that process comes back with a decline. So if JAG has reviewed that based on what the school has sent, you then can put in a parental placing request again to that place, providing extra information from the parent perspective on why this is a necessary placement for your young person. And then if that is refused, then you can go to tribunal to pursue an appeal process through it's a much more formalized process to do that because it comes under the additional support needs legislation. So Let's Talk ASN can provide specialist independent advocacy if you're needing that, if you're going down that route. Education other than at school. So those are examples of mainstream specialist in building standards schooling. Here's education other than at school. So flexi schooling. What is flexi schooling? It is a full-time education arrangement between the parent or the guardian and the area education manager. So this is one of those things that we have to go to the area education manager to request sometimes, whereby children split time between physical school and at-home school. So at home education or something else that they're doing and being in school. An appropriate balance of what that would look like for that young person has to be discussed, which is why it usually requires an approval from the area education manager. We have to agree, what does that look like? And also, is the school going to be able to provide that? Because you might think that the best arrangement is so-and-so, but they can't do that because of staffing or something. So the important thing with flexi schooling is that your young person remains registered in school as a full-time student. And so this is a fully funded place. You don't end up having to pay anything out of pocket for this. And who is entitled to request flexi schooling? Flexi schooling itself is not an entitlement. You are not entitled to say, I will now be flexi schooling my child and they have to give it to you. But the right to request it is an entitlement. And this is a right for all parents and guardians. You do not have to have, your child does not have to have an identified additional support need in order for you to request flexi schooling. Anybody can do it. So you can just be like, as a family, it works best for us for our young person to have a break day in the middle of the week. So we want them to go Monday, Tuesday. We'll be doing home stuff on Wednesday, and then Thursday, Friday, they're going to be in school. And any parent can request that. When reviewing your request, the area education manager will make a judgment on the individual circumstances and whether or not the school can support that. And that's how they decide whether or not they're going to grant flexi schooling. So how do you do it? It has been my experience that there can be an informal arrangement depending on what the school is able to provide, or a more formal arrangement. So you can discuss this potential with the head teacher of the school, or the ASN teacher, and they themselves can be like, yeah, no, that works, and it's no big deal, and we'll just work out how we're doing things, and yeah, bring them in on Monday, Tuesday, then they'll not be here on Wednesday. We'll see them Thursday, Friday. And you can have that informal agreement with them, and the school can request for you, or the school can just agree that with you, or the school could request that you make the formal application to Highland Council, to the area education manager. And if they ask that you do that, then a letter must be sent to the area education manager to request the flexi schooling, detailing why you want this and your initial thoughts around how it would work. The education support officer who works with the area education manager might contact you, or the area education manager might contact you directly to talk about this a little bit more. And then they will let you know in writing within 6 weeks, if they think that that is a manageable thing for them to do. And if you need help with this, you can contact Thriving Families for support with that process. There's home education, which then is a part of flexi schooling, if that's something you want to do, or you can just do home education full time. So every parent or guardian can choose to home educate instead of enrolling their child in a traditional setting. If they're already in a traditional setting, then you have to request, you have to make a request for them to be removed from the register. You don't have to have any formal teaching qualifications to home educate your child. The requirement is that you have to be providing an efficient education that's suitable for the age and capability of the child, and the aptitude of the child. And the Highland Council website itself says, about the education you need to provide, that parents or guardians can choose, who choose home education, do not have to follow the traditional school curriculum. They don't have to use a fixed timetable that keeps the school hours and terms. But what they do need to do is they need to demonstrate that they're providing an education that is suitable for the child, with appropriate variety, resources, and access to other children. And that access to other children is a big thing, because they want to make sure that young people aren't being isolated. So how do you request home education? You have to seek consent from Highland Council to withdraw your child from the school roll if they're already enrolled in a local authority school. And the way that you make that request is by writing to the appropriate area education manager, as far in advance as possible of the date that you wish to withdraw them, including in your initial proposal how you intend to provide an efficient and suitable education for your child based on what I was talking about on the other slide. How are you going to provide that variety and access to other children? And then if you want, you can include your reasons for withdrawing your child, but you don't have to include that part, because that isn't a requirement for them to make the determination. Again, Scottish government guidance is that a decision should be issued within 6 weeks of the receipt of the original request. And until that consent is granted, Highland Council prefers that your child continues to attend school. But I think most of us know that if you've gotten to the point where you're feeling you need to withdraw your child from education, it's probably a more urgent situation, and you don't need to feel pressured by that. So when is consent from the Highland Council not required to home educate? Well, if your child has never attended a public school, so they've gone to nursery, but they haven't actually gone to school. The child has never attended a public school in that authority's area. So if you're moving into the area, the child is being withdrawn from an independent school, or the child has finished primary education in one school but has not started secondary education in another. So if you're just leaving primary school and you're not moving on to secondary, and the school has been the school they've been attending has closed on them. So there is no statutory duty on parents to inform a local authority that they are home educating if they do not require consent to do so. So if you meet these criteria, you don't have to inform the council that you're home educating your child. But local authorities prefer that you do, and tell them if you're home educating, just so that they have some visibility on that young person. And as you can see there from the little yellow box, it can be beneficial to the child because it means they continue to get notifications for things like vaccinations, and other government issued things like that. So if you home educate, how often will you have to talk with people? Which is a big question, I think. What contact will I have with the council if I home educate? An area education manager or the education supporting officer will make contact with the family by email or letter at least annually. It might be more, to update the education provision and offer advice if it's requested. Parents can choose to provide their update via a meeting or in writing, so you don't actually have to see people. And as an autistic person, that's very important to me. I far prefer to do things in writing. The young person's views are always welcomed in whatever format is best for them. And actually, I would say that they should be central. Certainly as the child is getting older, if they're able to speak for themselves in meetings and things like that, it's always very impactful to hear that child's voice directly. And more frequent contact can be requested if there are concerns about how home education is going. And in situations where it's been identified that you're, as a home educator, aren't providing those things that are required to be provided, and that hasn't gotten any better as time has gone on, then the council can make an attendance order. And that allows the parent up to 14 days to provide the council with information to satisfy them about the quality of education that's being offered at home. If that's not done, the child will be expected to return to school. But if you're getting as far as that, then I would suggest that support from either ourselves or someplace like Govern Law, who's really good with education law and things like that, that might be important to you at that stage. So important information. The Highland Council has no legal responsibility to provide additional support when your child is home educated. And that includes speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, and DOS assessment. They can choose to provide it, but they are not required to do so. A local authority may not unreasonably withhold consent. So if they have denied your request for it, they have to provide in writing exactly why, like what the grounds are for that refusal. If consent is withheld, then you have the opportunity within a reasonable time to address that and to resubmit your request for consideration. There is no statutory right to appeal against a decision to withhold consent. However, all decisions should be reviewed internally on request, and parents should be given the details of the official complaint procedure. So there's still a complaint procedure. The complaint procedure will be measuring the council against their own policies, though. And a young person's rights under My Rights, My Say still apply if they are home educated. And I should note, if you're home educated, you can still access qualification exams like SQA exams and things like that. Other options. There's online learning. There are free and paid options, and I've included a bunch of links there, but you can see there's a bunch of, for secondary school, there's UHI things online that are free. There are things like King's Inter-High and Scottish Highers online, which are paid for, but provide a fairly quality education. Same thing with Scottish online lessons. HOPS there, Highland Online Primary School, that's free. That's available to anybody. Just go there right now and you can get all sorts of information. That's just a digital learning site. Another version of this is, or someone asked before about the Highland Tutoring Service. The Highland Tutoring Service would come under online learning, and that is, it has changed a lot in the last couple of years. So the Highland Tutor Service used to be called the Highland Virtual Academy, and it was, excuse me, meant for interrupted learners. So for example, if you broke your leg and you couldn't get into the school building for 6 weeks or something, that was what it was set up for. It was set up a long time ago. And then during COVID, it became much more relevant. And then after COVID, a lot of young people with additional support needs who suddenly realized that they didn't actually have to go to school because they hadn't been to school for so long, and they realized actually what the impact of going to school was on them, and they didn't want to go back. A lot of young people including my son, found that going into a physical school was overwhelming. And so they found a home at Highland Virtual Academy that has, last year it was changed to called Highland Tutoring Service. And the focus now is much more on temporary, back onto that temporary support rather than long-term support. And they're trying to make sure that young people are being put back to their core school, their home school. Because even when you were on Highland Virtual Academy, you still were considered to be registered with your catchment school. So although my son was on the Highland Virtual Academy, his guidance teacher from his home school was still the one that was our contact. So yeah, Highland Tutoring Service is there, but spaces to that are now provided by JAG, and you can't get in just by requesting it from the guidance teacher as you used to be able to do in the past. Other other alternatives that are in person, not online learning, but just different kinds of learning. There's My Future, My Success, which is a mentoring program through the council, which works on life, work, and learning skills. So they work on things like creating a CV and getting a job, interview skills, things like that. There's Forest School, and there's a Brechin, but there's also local groups that provide that kind of thing, where home ed groups where they get together and go walking through the forest. There's Agus Nature Days, which is a fabulous program, and I can't say enough about it. My youngest son goes there, and the staff there are just phenomenal and understanding and accepting and welcoming. That's the environment. Let me tell you, that's the environment that all our young people should be in. They're fabulous. Eden Court has Futures Studio and their different catalog of studio programs, so different classes and things. They have very targeted groups to age groups and things like that. So there's a lot of variety there. There's Glockbeg, which is like farming and countryside stuff. If they're much more practical oriented, like if that's the kind of thing that your young person's interested in, and there are a wide range of home ed groups and collections of home ed groups in Highland that are very supportive and welcoming spaces. And so you can do one of those, or you can create your own unique learning blend of hybrid approaches. So let's throw in some forest school, and we'll have a little bit of online learning and make sure that flexi schooling is in place, and we'll whiz it all up and get our own flavor of what learning looks like for our young person. Because for most young people with additional support needs, the reality is that a standard 5-day-a-week school program is not one that is going to suit them, their learning style, or their needs. So our key takeaways today. The presumption of the Scottish Government is that mainstream settings are best for all students. Supports can be provided in mainstream settings to make them more manageable. There are existing processes to assess when specialist placements are appropriate. A staged approach to learning support must be used and evidenced. And learning can take place in many different ways and in many different places. So learning is available in Highland in a wide variety of means. If you need more info, you can check out our Thriving Families website, which we recently updated, and there's a excellent resource section. If I do say so myself, I created it, and lots of information there. I included in the information that you'll get today will be all the resources and the references, but I've created this slide that has access to different home education groups or the links for them. The personalized support plan is there, the link for that, and the neurodevelopmental profile wheel, both the document and a series of doing over the last 6 weeks on understanding the areas of development so that you can get a better grip on how to use that. I've included local resources there. So the Pines, Thriving Families, the Pines YouTube channel, where Allison mentioned about the suite of videos that we have there of support videos that this recording will be added to. There's other ones there. How to access occupational therapy, speech and language, where you can find your area education managers. And I've added in the Highland branch there. If autism or even just neurodivergence in general, we're pretty flexible at the Highland branch to support people in understanding their young people and helping the other adults around them to understand the young people. We do a lot of work around that as a volunteer group. And then that neurodivergent affirming understanding box is about the people that are kind of like the safe people that understand what it means to have to live in a world that is not neurodivergent friendly. And so I can recommend those people. And then these are just different references with links to things that I've talked about today.